Bewildered Butchers. Butchers at Britain's best-known meat market, London Smithfield, complained in 1654 about weekly visits by a phantom mischief maker. They said the ghost of a lawyer, called Mallet, glided between their stalls each Saturday evening, pulling joints of meat from the slabs. Traders who had hit out at him with cleavers and carving knives had merely sliced through thin air. To this day, no one knows what that phenomenon was. Noose for a Strangler. George Gaffney was a petty thief. He operated from London's seedy Soho red light district in the early years of the last century. His crimes were all minor except for one, and that was the most serious of all. On the first day, March 1910, Gaffney saw on a street seller's cart a strange 3-foot length of woven silk rope which he recognized as Thuggee cord, used by the Hindu assassin sect in the Middle East to dispatch their victims. Gaffney bought it. 2 weeks later, he used it. The cheap thief had been having problems with a girl named Bessie Graves, who expected him to marry her because she was pregnant. But Gaffney wooed her under the alias of Arthur Eames. Now he found a much more promising opportunity. An elderly, rich widow named Stella Fortney. Called by a hysterical landlady, Scotland Yard detectives found Bessie Graves, the strangler's cord drawn so tightly around her throat it was embedded in her flesh. Their only clue was that the probable strangler was a man called Arthur Eames. It was little for the yard to go on, and 3 weeks later Gaffney was still at large, pursuing his romance with the widow. It occurred to him one night that he'd make a much more impressive appearance if he called on the lady in a hansom cab. A second later he was screaming. In the half-light of the closed vehicle, George found Bessie Graves sharing a seat with him. The dead girl's eyes stared glassily into his, and the swollen tongue lolled from her mouth. For more than a week, Gaffney drank steadily. Then he went to see Stella. She was far from friendly that evening, but melted when Gaffney gave her a stolen diamond ring. They shared a bottle of champagne, after which she sent him to the cellar for another. Bearing a kerosene lamp, Gaffney was sent halfway down the steps when Bessie Graves climbed out of the darkness to meet him. She had succeeded in loosening the strangler's cord, which swung from her throat like a necklace. But the staring eyes were worse. Screaming, Gaffney threw the lamp at her and crashed headlong to the bottom of the stairs. Gaffney spent 3 weeks in the hospital, and when he left he decided he only had one chance at throwing off the ghost who would not leave him alone. If he put England behind him forever, perhaps Bessie Graves would remain there too. He booked passage on the liner Montrose for Quebec. With renewed hope, he checked into a small hotel on the eve of the voyage. But in the semi-gloom of the room, he saw Bessie yet again. This time she had freed herself from the silken noose and was holding it out to him. Feebly he took it from her claw-like fingers. When he lifted his eyes again, Bessie had vanished, but the message was obvious. Gaffney sat down and began to scrawl his confession. He told in detail Bessie's murder and of her successive visits from the tomb, and now he said there was no possible escape. Called by the hotel staff, men from the yard broke into Gaffney's room. They found the thief hanging from a beam. They read his confession and agreed at once that the case of the Soho Strangler was closed. Yet there's one element in the case that puzzled him. For the first time, a vital piece of evidence had vanished from the yard's thief-proof vaults. It was the Thuggee cord, the same cord that Gaffney used to hang himself in the closet. The Duke's Grief. York Villa, the building in historic Bath that now houses a bus company social club, has had several supernatural visitors over the years. A young boy, a lady in gray, and a man in a lone cloak have all been seen, and footsteps have been heard walking around upstairs. All the ghostly happenings are said to date back to the time when the house was the home of one of the mistresses of Frederick, Duke of York, the son of George III. When he left for London, after telling her their affair was over, the mistress decided to follow him, instructing her servants to take care of her 2 children. But the staff had not been paid for some time and left the house. When one old retainer returned some days later, he found the 2 children starved to death. The footsteps sadly climbing the stairs are said to be his. The Bloodstone Ring. Gale force winds lashed the tiny English village of Willisham, ripping slates from the roofs and tearing limbs from the trees. A huge old oak shuddered before the onslaught, and then caught by one mighty gust, toppling, its roots tearing at the earth beneath. Villagers who rushed to the spot to see if anyone was hurt stopped in horror as they gazed between the gnarled roots. There lay some human remains. Police Constable Klug, the only bobby in the East Anglian community, was called, and he ordered that the body be taken from its strange grave. One of the dismembered hands had a ring on one finger. Acting on a hunch, the grim-faced constable carried the hand to Ellen Gray, sister of a girl who had vanished mysteriously 18 years before in 1873. Ellen screamed and then hugged the ghastly relic to her breast. "It's Mary," she sobbed. "The Bloodstone Ring was my wedding gift. She was born in March, and it was her birthstone." Klug understood. Though the case was before his time, it was so well known in the area, it had been the subject of a popular ballad. On her 18th birthday, Mary Gray had married Basil Osborne. She had written a letter to John Bodneys, her sweetheart since childhood, asking for his forgiveness. An hour before the groom was to take her away on the honeymoon, Mary told her sister she wanted to spend a little time alone in the upstairs room they'd shared. When Osborne arrived with the carriage, she still hadn't come down. Frightened, they forced their way into the locked bedroom, but found no trace of the bride. One window opened onto a balcony where a flight of steps led to an enclosed garden. The garden, too, was empty. The abandoned bridegroom died a month later. Villagers blamed a broken heart. Now, 18 years later, the village knew what had become of Mary, for the skeleton had a broken neck. Ellen refused to give up her murdered sister's hand. It had been brought to her for a purpose, she said. That purpose must be fulfilled. Dying, she left a bizarre provision in her will. Her housekeeper, Maggie Williams, was to have her estate, but must display the hand in some public place, or it may someday confront the murderer. Maggie opened what became the finest pub in Willisham, and gave the hand a place of honor on one wall. Enclosed in glass against a black velvet background, the bony ring fingers claimed the attention of everyone. After the shock of the exhibit had worn away, the tale of Mary's murder was a frequent topic of conversation. On a dismal March night in 1895, a stranger sat listening to scraps of the talk. "Must have been just a night as this when the wind ripped out that old oak tree," said the publican. The stranger, a brooding man with a ravaged face, looked up from his glass. "I don't understand. What oak tree?" he asked. "Have a look at the case on the wall, then we'll tell you the story," the old barman told him. Moments later, the stranger was screaming. He sagged against the wall, blood dripping from his fingers. An older man at the bar recognized him as Mary's missing former sweetheart, John Bodney's. When Constable Klug arrived, the bleeding man confessed to the murder of Mary Gray. In a frenzy of jealousy, he had found the bride alone in her room. Muffling her cries, he carried her from the house. Bodneys insisted they had not meant to kill her, but when they reached the big oak tree, she was struggling so hard he had broken her neck. He left her in a shallow grave under the oak and tried to put Willisham behind him forever. But there had never been a moment of peace since the crime. Inevitably, he had been compelled to return. Committed to the local jail to await trial, he died of no known disease, before his trial could even be held. The authorities dismissed the old wife's tale that a murderer's hands sometimes drip blood when he faces a proof of his crime, but the people of the village knew what they'd seen. They buried Mary Gray's hand with the rest of her skeleton, then ceremoniously burned the shirt smeared by John Bodney's bloody fingers the day he came face to face with his guilt. Thanks for sitting around and humoring an old fox and his tales. If you'd like more, please hit like and subscribe. And remember, nothing is more frightening than a fear you cannot name.